Okay, guys, thanks for tuning in today. So what I'm going to talk about is just run through the winter wheat varieties that we have in the crop testing program this year. And if you see the picture here on the title slide, we did post a sign along with a document box at 7 locations throughout the state. Given this COVID pandemic we're going through, we're not allowed to have in-person tours. So we decided to put these document boxes up so people could come and visit some locations on their own and walk through the plots if they would like. And at the end of my slide, I have the web link to where the directions to the plots are posted on the extension website, along with a list of the locations. So in addition to this webinar, we filmed a virtual tour of the winter wheat varieties, and that will be posted eventually on the extension website. It'll be on YouTube as well, but I don't have the information for that yet, and I'm not sure when that will be ready for viewing. But if you're interested in winter wheat varieties, I'd recommend you checking that out. So just kicking things off here, what we're going to do, I just went through and I took a picture of each variety. It might be a little bit difficult to see some of the differences in a picture versus being out there, but we'll just still run through them pretty briefly, and I'll just say a couple sentences about each one. So first, on the left there, we have AP18AX. That is a new coaxium variety from AgriPro. Their new designation, instead of SY as it has been in the past, will now be AP. And this is their first coaxium variety. Coaxium is a new technology. It's a natural mutation for a herbicide resistance against aggressor herbicide. What is that? Is it Quizalofop or something like that? Basically, it's so you can control grasses in your wheat. Looks to be a little bit better than Clearfield. Maybe better is the wrong word to use, but a different option than Clearfield. So this is the first year we've seen coaxium in the trials, and I should mention finally that is certified seed only. In fact, most of the coaxium varieties are going to be certified seed only, so single year use. Okay, next there we have Cowboy. Cowboy is a joint release from Wyoming and Colorado. I would say it's yielded pretty well in the trials, especially in the western part of the state. I guess as you could guess, being from Wyoming, it's pretty well adapted to western South Dakota as well. Good yields, low protein content, and it doesn't show it in this picture, but I have seen this one pretty susceptible to some lodging. So, okay, Winfield is a new participant in our trials this year. Here I have the first two from them. I will not say a whole lot about these because they're brand new and I don't know much. I will say the first one, I did make a handout up like I typically do. That's available on the website. So I do have a brief description that was provided by the company, and that is provided to me. And I put it in the handout, but I'm not going to read it here. So the first one, 7010, actually stood up at our Mount Vernon site, which had a 90-mile-an-hour wind. So that one stood very well. They all look pretty good. Second one here is a coaxium variety, and then we'll just look at the third and fourth ones here. 7050AX and 7909. 7050AX also stood up in that 90-mile-an-hour wind in Mount Vernon. So you can see 7909 looks a little bit lodgy here, but again, all four of these are new to the trial. I don't know anything about them. We'll see how they do. I should mention all the varieties from Winfield or Cropland are single season use only. So you got to buy new seed every year. Okay, two more new ones. We have a lot of new material this year. Crescent AX is from Plains Gold of the Colorado State Program. That's a coaxium variety. Defensive traits are its, I guess it's claim to fame, they're saying, but it also yields fairly well. That one is certified seed only too, which I never thought I would see from a public breeding program, but I guess that's probably the way of the future. Next there we have LCS Diesel, which is just released from Lima Grain. Highly defensive, good FHB resistance. It's new, so I don't know much about it. Company website says it's well adapted to South Central South Dakota. Okay, the next two here, Draper was released from our program last year, fall of 2019. So certified seed producers were able to grow it. I'd say yields are very good for Draper, good lodging resistance. It was best overall 3-year yield in western South Dakota and third best in central South Dakota. So this one would be, I would say, more well adapted to central and western South Dakota, although it still does okay in the east, but not its primary area of adaptation. Expedition, this is the oldest material we have in the trial. You can see some disease pressure in this photo here. Good baking and milling qualities. It's kind of still a standard for that. We leave it in the trial just to show how, I guess, newer materials do better. So yields are typically near the bottom for Expedition. Did I skip one? Nope, I'm on track. Okay, next, Flathead and Guardian, also both new ones. So I'll be quick. Flathead is from Montana. That's their newest release. This is the first year for participation from the Montana breeding program. And it looks really good to me. I guess we'll see how it does. Guardian is a new release from Colorado State or Plains Gold. This is not a coaxium. I guess they say it has 2 resistance genes for wheat streak mosaic, so it might be one to look at if you have wheat streak mosaic virus. But again, this one's new. Even though this one's not coaxium, it is certified seed only. So that makes me suspect that anything released from Colorado at this point out is going to be certified seed only. Okay, next we have Ideal. Ideal was released from South Dakota State here in, I believe, 2012. Later maturing. This one has done pretty well the last couple of years because we haven't had much of a stripe rust problem. But if you have stripe rust, I would not, or if you're worried about stripe rust, I wouldn't recommend planting Ideal. But otherwise, it can still kick out some pretty good yields. I would just say that it's not super consistent. Next one on this slide is Keldon from Westbred. Keldon seems to do very well in the eastern part of the state. It's a very late maturing winter wheat. As you can see here, it's still pretty green. So in a high yield environment, I think Keldon is a very good choice. And Westbred has more material in the trial, which we'll get to later on. Okay, we have Langen here on the left. Langen is from Colorado State. We saw this one first in 2017, and it really just, I would say it just kicked butt in 2017. It won nearly every location, and I had South Dakota producers calling me asking where to get seed. But since 2017, it just hasn't performed really well in 2018 and 2019. I'd say average at best. So I guess moral of the story is don't look at just one year when you're picking a variety. I think Langen does better in a drier year with more heat. Okay, next we have another new one from Lima Grain. This is their coaxium Helix AX, and I don't know much about it. The company tells me it's got a pretty good disease package. And from what they tell me, this one is not certified seed only, which I find hard to believe since it's a herbicide tolerant winter wheat, but that's what they're telling me. So we'll see how it does. On the left here, we have NE 14696, which is an experimental from Steve Batesinger in Nebraska. He sent me a rather lengthy description of it. I'm not going to go through it. This is the first year I've seen it, so I guess we'll see how it does. Yeah. And probably the most distinctive we have next is MTF 1435. This is actually out of the Montana breeding program, but Sioux Nation Ag Center is the one who submitted it to the trials because they have a joint a partnership, I would say, with Montana to sell this as a forage wheat in South Dakota, I believe Nebraska, and maybe North Dakota. I don't remember the details specifically, but this one is kind of a replacement for Willow Creek, if any of you are familiar with that forage wheat out of Montana. So very similar to Willow Creek, although they say the grain yields are 30% higher, 30 to 35% higher than Willow Creek. So in other words, maybe a dual purpose. I guess Sioux Nation put it in the trials this year just to see how the grain yields would do. But very distinctive, awnless. It's always easy to pick out of the plots. Okay, another new one here on the left, Northern. This one also is from Montana. This one looks like it's staying pretty green. I'm actually fairly impressed with the stuff from the Montana program. It's going to be interesting to see how it yields overall. But another new one, average test weight, average protein. They say it's resistant to stripe rust and stem rust. So to be determined. And then NW13493. This is the second year for this guy from Nebraska. This is a white winter wheat. This is the only white one we have in the trial. Dr. Bainsinger said there's no doubt it would be released if it was a red winter wheat, but unless they can find a specialty end user, I doubt that this one will be released. Apparently it's very good for making crackers. But we saw it last year, as I said, and I would say yields were nothing special in South Dakota. So it doesn't seem to be too well adapted. We'll see how it does this year. Okay, Oahe and Overland. Oahe was released, if I can remember, I'd say around 2015 or 16 without looking at my notes here. Oahe's got excellent yield potential. Do not put fall nitrogen on this one, however, because it can get lodgy. I have seen it kick out some very high yields, but lodging, as I said, can be concerned. Keep the population in check with this one too. So good winter hardiness on Oahe as well. Overland, the next one is from Nebraska in 06. There's still a fair amount of acres being planted to Overland in South Dakota. Despite the age, 14 years old, it's still in the top 1/3 in central and just out of the top third in western South Dakota. So where there's not much disease pressure, Overland still is a pretty good solid winter wheat. Okay, next one is Redfield. Redfield, I always think is such a pretty wheat. You can pick it out from a mile away because of its distinctive red chaff. Redfield, I would say in my trials, yields are only maybe about average. I'd say they're fairly consistent, but they never really seem to be toward the top end of the trials. So I think some of the newer stuff is better, but just a good consistent variety overall. Next we have SY517 CL2. That is from AgriPro or Syngenta. That is the Clearfield variety that they have in the trials. In fact, only Clearfield variety that we have left in the trials. And yields have not been that great in the CPT. I believe this will be the 4th year we've had it, or 3rd year, I don't remember, 4th year. And while the yield performance is not that great, I have some producers who seem like they really like it, and it's just a good option if you need that Clearfield technology. Okay, the next two are also from AgriPro. We have Monument on the left and Sunrise on the right. Monument, I would say, arguably is the one to beat, if not in the entire trial. It's my favorite one from the AgriPro program. That one just seems to be a solid, good yielder throughout the state. When they sent it to me, I think we saw it first 5 years ago, they said we don't want to test it on the eastern part of the state, but it does very well in the east as well. On that note, Sunrise, I would say I would not really recommend that one for the western part of the state. That one is more of an irrigated wheat, high population, high yield environment. It likes a lot of water. So Sunrise, I'd say, is probably best adapted for the eastern part of the state, and maybe the central, as long as you get adequate rainfall. But I don't know, they're so two pretty solid entries from AgriPro there. Okay, the last one from AgriPro is Wolverine. This is a replacement for Cy Wolf. I don't probably need to talk about that one if you're a winter wheat producer. Cy Wolf was very dominant. I think it was about 35% of all the acres in South Dakota as of a couple of years ago. So they say this is agronomically very similar to Cy Wolf with a 7% bump in yield. I would say I was a little disappointed in the yields last year. We'll see how it does this year, although I still think Monument looks like it's better. I think I put a slide at the end where I'll talk about that a little bit. Okay, moving on, we have Thompson. Thompson was released, I believe, a year after Oahe, and good adaptation for the central part of the state, but about average, I'd say, in the west and the east. So just a good one for the central part of the state. Okay, now we're getting to the west bred material. Grainfield I think has been in the winter wheat trial since I started this job in 2014, and I've seen it kick out some pretty good yields. It's been very consistent. However, it's getting to be a little bit of an older variety, 8 years old now, and it's becoming resistant to, I believe, stem and leaf rust, and it's very short maturing, so it does better in the absence of rust and in a warmer, drier year. So I think that might explain why it hasn't done so well the last 2 years, but we'll see how it does this year. Just getting some age on it. 4309, I believe this is the second year that we've seen 4309. Oh, my mistake. I was thinking of 4595. So this is the first year of testing for 4309. It looks a little bit similar to Grainfield, but I don't know much about it. We'll see how it does. 4462, that one has been very solid the last 2 years. In fact, I would almost argue it's my favorite one out of the west bred portfolio, and probably a contender for one of the better ones in the trial. This will be the third year, so we'll have 3-year yield averages after this year. I will say it does show some susceptibility to stripe rust, but early maturing, average protein content, and good test weight. So good one from west bred. 4595 is also from west bred. This will be the second year for this one. Had a fairly good year last year. I believe it was second place overall yielder over 1 year in central South Dakota. So it does show some pretty good potential. 4595 and I believe 4309 are certified seed only from west bred. Okay, the last two, I shouldn't say the last two, the last release variety from the South Dakota State program is Winter. Winter was released at the same time as Draper last fall. Winter was named in part for the town of Winter, South Dakota, obviously, but also because it's a plot winter. This thing will yield up with anything. So I would look for good yields from this one this year. It looks pretty good throughout the state. So this was certified. This went to certified growers only, along with Draper last fall. So this fall, it'll be available for any producer. And the last one here, before I get to a couple of experimentals, is 14 Nord-1. This is an experimental line from NDSU. They do have a winter wheat breeding program up there, and I invited them to participate. So they sent this down, and I think it looks pretty solid. So I guess we'll see how it does. And the last two here, I don't have a lot of information on these. Typically, Sumish kind of talks about these. These are the two varieties that would be closest to release in the South Dakota State program. So I believe, I can't remember, I think this 3282 on the left may be a potential for release in August here, but I think 2346 is 1 year out. So 3282, good solid yields, third and fourth among released varieties in western central South Dakota over 3 years. So I'd say if this one holds together, it'll have a good potential of being released this year. One other note on that one is it also stood up in the 90-mile-an-hour winds in Mount Vernon, so good lodging resistance. And then the other experimental, as I said, don't know much about it. It did fairly well in western South Dakota last year, but that one will need 1 more year of evaluation before we decide whether or not to release. Okay, my last slide showing varieties here. I just want you to look at these 3 AgriPro varieties side by side. Monument, Sunrise. You know what? I have those exactly backwards. So the label for Monument, that's actually Wolverine on the left and Monument on the right. I don't know what I was doing when I put this together, but so Monument is on the right, Sunrise is in the middle, and Wolverine's on the left. And just look at the difference in senescence there. How Wolverine is drying out, Sunrise is maybe second, and then Monument on the right, the leaves are staying green. So that makes me think that Monument's probably going to yield a little bit better than either Sunrise or Wolverine at this location. Again, I apologize for getting the labels backwards there. So for further information, I have listed here sites where we have the document boxes set up so you can go look at the plots yourselves. Brookings, Hazel, right up here, Selby, Wall, and Winter. And this website, if you click on that, it will give you directions to the plots, GPS coordinates, and then there's a link on the bottom of that webpage that has the handout. The handout is in the document boxes at each site, but if you want to print one out and just review it without looking at the plots here, you can do that too. So leave this up here just a bit if you want to take a picture with your phone or it'll be recorded. But then my last slide is the contact information. So if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will be doing a virtual tour of, like I said, we filmed a virtual tour. It will be going up on YouTube. I plan to do a virtual tour. We actually filmed the one for oats this morning, and we'll probably be doing spring wheat next week. So those will be coming up online eventually as well. I'm not sure whether we'll do a webinar on those. I guess we'll decide that down the road. But thank you for your attention today. And if there's no questions, Phil, I guess that's what I've got.
All right. Thanks, Phil. So as my title says today, we're going to be talking about soybean gall midge. And it's an update, so that means that yes, they are here again, and we are seeing them in the soybean fields. So one of the things we started doing a couple years ago for soybean gall midge is monitoring their emergence in the spring. And to do this, we use modified corn rootworm emergence cages as seen in this picture. So it's not an extremely high-tech method of monitoring, but it's very effective. And we place these cages out in bean stubble. So last year's soybean, we typically look for soybean fields that had an infestation of the soybean gall midge, and then we place several traps starting on the edge of the field and moving inwards. We check these traps on a weekly basis, and we're looking for soybean gall midge adults. So as you can see, the trap is essentially a wooden frame. It has some netting. The netting comes up into a glass jar, kind of like a funnel here, and then the insects fly up, and because it's a small opening, they don't know how to get back out through that cloth. So it traps them, and we can determine what was inside the jar at the end of the week. And so this is what we're looking for when we're putting these traps out in the field. These are the soybean gall midge adults. Now, they look pretty large in this slide here, but they're actually pretty small. They're 1/4 of an inch, and that's from the front leg, tip of the front leg, to the tip of the back leg. So they're actually pretty small. They'll fit on the head of a penny. And so what do we look for? They're small. Well, we need some characteristics. One of the things we look for is the orange abdomen. So we can't see it in this picture here because the wings are covering it, but they have an orange abdomen, and more importantly, they have these alternating black and white patterns on their legs. And so those are very distinctive when we're looking at them. And if you notice, they also have pretty long legs, which helps us pick them out from other insects that we might be capturing, especially other small flies. And like I mentioned just now, they are flies, so they only have the one pair of wings. Then they have these little structures here. These are called the halteres. They're in place of the other pair of wings that other insects sometimes have. The halteres, though, for the soybean gall midge kind of stick out and they're white, so they can also sometimes help if there's a question about identification. So this is what it looks like when one of those little jars on a trap is collecting soybean gall midge adults. So the picture's not the highest quality, but gives you the idea that there's definitely the alternating patterns, and we get these under a microscope, and they're much, much easier to see. And so we see the slight orange abdomens, the alternating legs, and there's soybean gall midge. And so some traps have captured quite a few this year. So there's actually now a trapping network. So it's not just South Dakota where these traps are present. There's also traps being put out in Minnesota, in Nebraska, as well as in Iowa. I kind of cut the map, as you can see, because I wanted to focus on the South Dakota traps. Due to some travel restrictions this year, We weren't able to get traps in all of the counties we maybe wanted to target, but we did have a collaborator help us focus on the southeast corner of South Dakota, which has been the historical hotspot for the soybean gall midge. In the last few years, it's the southeastern part of the state that generally gets hit the earliest and the hardest. And so if we look here, as of last week, we had traps that were catching soybean gall midge adults, and some of them were capturing quite a bit. Now you'll notice these little red numbers here, those are new captures. Some of these traps didn't get new captures. That was because those fields were sprayed. And so the soybean gall midge were apparently effectively reduced. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the trapping network is set up, and there is information online for how to get connected to that. And so if you do want to be enrolled, you are able to, and you will get an email as well as a text or phone call, which will notify you as to where the most recent soybean gall midge emergences have been reported, and also tell you what time of the week it was reported in. So why do we care so much about this? Well, if we are able to know when the adults are emerging, theoretically we can target them with insecticide applications. And if we can do that, maybe we can reduce the impact of this pest. So what have we learned from the soybean gall midge emergence? Well, one of the big things, this is a key characteristic that we didn't know about before, is that these adults have delayed emergence. So some emerge early and some emerge pretty late. Ideally, you'd have the entire population coming out at one time, and so a foliar insecticide application would be able to come through and remove the pest. Now, we also have overlapping generations being observed in the field. So in addition to those ones that are still emerging from soybean stubble, there are reports of also having traps put out in current soybean fields that are infested and capturing adults in those fields. Now remember, those traps are placed in a way so only the soybean gall midge emerging from the soil are going to be captured. So if we're capturing new adults in a current soybean field, those were more than likely from the infested plants, and we have a new generation. So in addition to those new generations, we also have these ones from the previous year's crop due to that long emergence period. And that's going to make management a little bit more difficult. So this is what an early season infestation starts as. Out in the field, we'll start noticing wilting plants. And it won't necessarily be the entire edge of the field right away. As you can see in this picture, there's a few plants that are wilting. We'll point out that it is immediately adjacent to a cornfield. So this was last year's beans, so this is bean stubble. So the soybean gall midge moved in to the new soybean and began infesting it. And this is what that infestation looks like, beginning of the season. Another thing we've learned in the last couple years is that it seems like the soybean must have previous wounding or some sort of natural opening in the epidermis for the soybean gall midge to actually be able to get into the plant and infest it. So in some instances, we've observed hailstones acting as the entry points for this pest. However, when we look at soybean, especially after the V3 or third vegetative growth stage, we notice that there's this natural split in the stem near the soil surface, and that's due to rapid growth. So we get a little split. In a normal situation that would heal back over. You might have a little bit of scarring, but that would heal. But when the soybean gall midge is present, we notice that we begin to see some discoloration. And so what I'm looking at here is, as you can see, this is the soil surface, and here's about an inch above the plant, maybe an inch and a half, but we look from where it kind of stops being bright green, turns brown, right here. There's this discoloration. You can see where that natural split was occurring, but we really focus right here where it's a little bit discolored, almost a purple brown color. And at that point is also where we've talked a lot about how this pest can cause lodging due to woody stems. That's also where the lodging typically occurs. And so why is that? Well, I don't have a great picture of it here, but right here, is where those soybean gall midge larvae are. They're right under the epidermis, typically right in that area where the split was early season. And so this is what, as the infestation continues, so these pictures are what a field in July that's heavily infested will begin to look like. So this was the previous year's soybean stubble where the corn is planted. This is the current year's soybean. And what we see is there's this gradient pattern where right along the edge of that corn, the beans are almost completely gone. You can still see some dead plants in rows, but there aren't any green ones really. As we move into the field, you can kind of see browning occurring. As we get a little bit further, you can still see it's happening, but not as bad. So that's in July. So what's happening in those plants? Well, the larvae are actually feeding. And as they feed, they cause small galls that are almost unnoticeable in soybean, but they're present, slight swellings. And as those swellings occur, it reduces nutrient flow to the plant. And as a result, the plant begins to wilt and die. So these are what the larvae look like when they're under the epidermis. They can range in color from being kind of an orange to pink color to being a light pink to pretty much clear white. And researchers in Nebraska have determined that there are most likely 3 instars of this pest. So the first instars are the very small, almost clear white ones. The second instar are kind of a white to pinkish coloration. The second instar, that is. And then the third instar are these kind of a bright orange coloration. They're the largest size, and when they turn bright pink, that's your indicator that they're a late instar. And so one of the things we know with the soybean gall midge is that you can have a lot of each instar present in the plant. This is also kind of a unique thing because a lot of times when we think about insect development, we think of them being a little bit more uniform. When we see a pest out in the field, there can be a little bit of variation, but the soybean gall midge can have quite a bit. As you can see in this heavily infested plant, there's some early instars, so it looks like first, and some seconds with a lot of thirds present. And so if we think about as those populations continue to increase in the fields and as they move into the field, you can imagine that the infestation pattern looks a lot worse. So that gradient that I showed before in July, when we jump to mid to late August, we begin to see a lot more evidence that there's a problem in the field. So if we look here, before it was just a few rows that were definitely dead. Now you can see the browning goes further into the field. Then you have this yellow gradient, and then there is some natural senescence occurring, but there's still a lot more yellow moving into the field than if we look towards the center. So these are plants that are most likely infested, and it's moving in. The other thing with soybean gall midge infestations that's unique is that the pattern of infestation is quite uniform. Whenever you have some sort of environment that was conducive to their populations the previous year, that's where a lot of populations are going to move into. And we don't really see what we would think of as kind of a circular cluster of an infestation where it spreads out from that. The gradient goes along whatever the previous field. So in this case with soybean stubble, we've noticed that in sometimes shelter belts must act as some sort of reservoir. We aren't sure if they're overwintering there or if it's just because of the natural windbreak and populations get increased in those areas, but we'll see this same trend sometimes along trees. And so when we're scouting, early season, we're looking for wilting plants. Later in the season, we're looking for edges of the field with dead or dying plants, as seen in this picture. Another thing we look for later in the season is the more pronounced lodging. So earlier in the season, the lodging can occur, but it's not as noticeable because the plants aren't quite as tall. As we move into the later season, we notice the lodging a lot more. So this is also a lot easier to see that little bit of swelling, but one of the other characteristics that's always present is that discoloration right here. So when we're out scouting this time of the year, things to watch for, because we know the larvae are now in plants and all of the states where we are observing emergence of the adults. So the larvae are now in soybean. So when you're scouting, watch for wilting plants, discolored stems, or that little bit of stem swelling. Also watch for dead plants on the edges of the field. So it doesn't necessarily have to be right along the road, but if you have corn next to beans, with just a small, maybe a foot or so border between the two, or just a fence line, those are areas to really watch for. Another thing to do is to really focus on soybean that are near previously infested soybean fields. So these are going to be the really pronounced hot spots. You also need to watch for soybeans that are near groves or shelter belts. As I mentioned, we aren't exactly sure what's occurring here, but we know that we do see increased infestations in these areas, and more research needs to be done to figure out what exactly is causing that. And something that we haven't mentioned yet today in this talk is that earlier planted soybean are going to be at more increased risk for infestation. Some research from last year and also observations in the last couple years have indicated to us that the earlier planted soybean are going to be hit first by the soybean gall midge. Now that's not a huge surprise, because as the gall midge are emerging, those plants that were planted earliest are going to have those natural splits already occurring. So later planted soybeans can have quite a bit of a reduced infestation when compared to earlier plantings. Now, when we're talking about this, we aren't talking about a month and a half difference. In some cases, it was 2 weeks. And 2 weeks can make a big difference for the infestation. So why do we care so much? Well, in fields in the last few years that we've looked where soybean gall midge was confirmed and was present, we've seen yield losses that range from 10 to 100% along the edges of the field, as shown in this yield map here. The dark red is extreme loss, so that's about 100%. But even as we move into the field, in some cases, you can see continued yield loss. And in some of these fields, and this isn't just in South Dakota, this has been done in other states as well, we're seeing entire field averages of soybean drop by 10 to 50%, just depending on when the soybeans were planted, how bad the infestation got, and of course, other abiotic factors can have an impact on this as well, especially if those beans maybe needed moisture late in the season. However, in most cases, when we're seeing soybean gall midge, it seems like the soybeans that have enough moisture, or maybe a little extra moisture, are the ones that are getting hit the hardest. And we think that probably has to do with that early season rapid growth. So far in the states where we've been looking for soybean gall midge, which now are just about every Midwest state, we've been able to find gall midge. So right now it's been confirmed in 5 states as well as 96 counties. Now, if we look at South Dakota, I mentioned that the heaviest infestations are typically in the southeast part of the state. However, if you notice, it moves northward also. And we've even found as far north and west as Edmonds County. So this pest is likely widespread. However, the impact isn't quite as bad the further north you go when we compare that to down here in the southeast. So far, we've seen later infestations in these counties compared to down here. And as a result, the plants aren't normally hit quite as hard. So some thoughts for early season management. So we're kind of getting past the window when some of this would be effective, but things to think about for next year. One of the things that's been shown to have very little to, I say here, minimal effect on emergence of the adults is spring tillage. Now, these do overwinter in the soil. The larvae spin a silken cocoon around themselves and they overwinter in the soil. But so far, spring tillage, where this has been evaluated, hasn't had much of an impact. These are very small, and chances are there's just not enough disruption. Something that has had some impacts, I was looking through some stuff from Nebraska. They saw upwards of at least 50% reduction in the emergence when they mowed the vegetation around fields. So mow the grass or the weeds seems to have an impact. Now, we aren't sure why. We do know that the soybean gall midge has 2 other hosts that we can commonly find around here, including alfalfa and sweet clover. However, those aren't typically in your road ditches or around the field edges, so there's obviously something else going on with this. Also, when foliar insecticides are applied at the onset, so when we first say adult emergence is occurring in an area, they can reduce infestations by around 50%. However, It's not going to be a complete reduction. You're not going to have 0 infested plants in those areas. You will still have some infestation occurring, and a lot of that has to do with that delayed emergence. As I mentioned, it's a long period of time that we see that overwintering population emerge from stubble. And so this isn't going to be a silver bullet, and unless the infestations have been very bad in the area before, I wouldn't recommend the foliar insecticides if it's just a few adults, because we don't know exactly how well those work. We know that it can reduce, but I also worry about having insecticide resistance build up in some of these populations if we aren't killing them. So those are things to think about, but there are some options now, and more research is going on for this. So with that, I'd like to give you all my contact information. And if you ever need to get a hold of me, especially this year, the easiest way to get a hold of me is to send me an email. I haven't been in my office much, but if you need to, my office number is right here. And I'm located in Brookings at the main campus.